Hi guys, Thom Hunt here in the kit room. Hope you're all staying safe in the coronavirus crisis. Yeah, we're all dreaming of getting out fishing again, and the only thing that can really compare to that in these times is sitting around and fiddling with your lures, tidying your kit up, changing your braid. So yeah, I've been spending a lot of time here in the kit room, and one of the things I want to go through today is pike lures. Now, there's a multitude of pike lures out there. There's hard baits, there's jerk baits, crank baits, spinner baits, chatter baits. But really, I would say soft baits, large, positive soft baits are my go-to for most of my pike fishing most of the time. Now, this is sort of classing what I call proper pike fishing. So proper kit, relatively very strong braid, decent wire traces, decent size hooks, decent size lures. Not really sort of covering the small pike you might get in small canals, you know, your 1 to 3 pounders. Really talking about once they're up to, you know, a jack of 4 or 5 pounds through to your kind of 20 pound, or if you're ever lucky enough to catch one on a lure, 30 pound fish, which is an exceptional milestone. But that kind of proper pike fishing is what I want to cover today. Now, if someone said to me I could only ever use one lure for pike fishing for the rest of forever, it would absolutely be this guy. The Westin Shad Teez, 16 centimeters in headlight color. It's been around for quite a while now, and this has got almost a cult status, this lure. It really is something special. Now, I've only been with Westin for about 6 months or so. I was aware of this lure beforehand, but really, you know, since my sponsorship has started, I've started using these in all the sizes. They come from small 7 and 9 centimeters, which are actually very, very excellent zander and perch lures. But I feel that this Shad Teez really excels in that kind of 12 and certainly in this 16 centimeter size, particularly for pike. It's a very aggressive lure. It's got a nice big paddle tail on it. It's got a nice deep body. And more than anything, what you're looking for in any pike fishing lure is body roll, okay? So when you're bringing it back through the water, the tail is so powerful. Yeah, you've got a nice big paddle tail on there that it's making that body twist backwards and forwards in the water. That body roll is really what fires those pike up and causes those strikes. So you've got to look for body roll. For me as well, this is the perfect balance. This plastic, you know, the combination between being soft enough that it's got loads of movement and it's really supple, but also, I don't know if you can see this, but this lure is absolutely shredded. I have caught so many, I mean, look at the size of the slice in that. I've caught so many pike on this lure, and you know, that's a testament to its durability as well. If you're going to spend money, once these lures start getting up to this size, you're going to start paying certainly a few quid for each of them. And, you know, there's other, if the plastic is too soft, you're really going to find after 1 or 2, maybe 3 fish, you know, the jig head will rip out, the tail will rip off, they'll just get shredded. And so for me as well, this is really just a case of good value for money. You know, I've caught loads of pike on this and it's still ready to go. So the Shad Teez, I can't recommend it highly enough. We've got such an amazing range of colours. We'll go through a few later on. But yeah, if you're only looking to get one lure, or my go-to lure, is definitely the 16 centimeter Shad Teez now. So let's go through some rigging options. I've got a few in my box here that are already rigged up. Here's a classic example. So, yeah, we've got a standard jig head round about the sort of 10 gram mark and a stinger on the back. So let's talk about the jig head to start with. Now, one of the mistakes I see a lot of people making is using a jig head with a hook that's too small. Once you're up to this kind of 5-6 inch kind of pike bait, which is where I would start, you really want to be looking at jig heads. If you're going to fish them like this, you've got to be looking for a jig head that's around about the 8.0 or 10.0 size. Now that sounds huge and it looks pretty huge before you rig it, but when you rig it, for me, this is a perfectly balanced lure. The size of the hooks, the size of the stinger, how it's rigged, the amount of point that's exposed, I think this is absolutely bang on. All right, a really good guide when you're pike fishing, if you can get your little finger underneath like that, for me, that means that there's enough on that main hook that's exposed. The wire's nice and thick as well. And you know, you want nice razor sharp hook points. And because that bony mouth that you're trying to strike into on a pike, you really got to try and get yourself a good hook hold. So make sure, I see too many people trying to rig these on 3.0s or 5.0s and they're too small or the wire's not strong enough. So make sure you're selecting the right jig heads. When it comes to a stinger, that's about a size 2, I think we've got on there. Good standard size. Obviously, when I go down to the 12 centimeter, I'm going to shrink that down to probably a size 6, something like that. But I will play around with the sizes of my stinger as well for a few different reasons. First one, the placement of the stinger there is just about right for me. I'm not so far down. Oh, blimey, I've got caught up here. Hang on. I'm not so far down the lure that it's impeding the paddle tail. You can see there's going to be loads of action in that paddle tail. All right, but it's not so close to the main hook that I really feel that if you've got that stinger way too close, they actually kind of impede each other on the strike. You'll rarely find that you'll get both hooks in. When you're catching a lot of pike on these, you'll rarely find that both hooks are in properly. They're either on the main hook or they tend to be on the stinger. And that's a top tip that I'd like to give you guys. Be aware of where you're hooking those pike in the mouth, because a normal pike, you know, you've probably all seen the water wolf underwater footage, be swimming along like this. A normal classic pike strike, when he's in a good mood, it will come up and open his mouth. You see all of those gills flare, and it reduces the pressure so much that it sucks the lure in. He then clamps. You'll normally feel a tick on the rod, and then quarter of a second later, the rod just loads up and you're into that bite, because he comes up, hits the lure like that, you'll get the tick. He then closes his mouth, turns. That's when you start feeling it and you'll strike into it. Most of the time, you're going to be on the main hook when you get a bite like that. However, if you do find yourself having 2 or 3 bites, and they're what I call coming up short on the lure, or you've got a lot of teeth marks in the tail, or around the back half of the lure, you've got to be switching over and playing around with the length of your stinger. So if I typically extend that, I will come literally all the way down. So that sits in the back of that lure into that paddle tail. And I will normally shrink the size of the stinger hook. I'll normally come down to a 6 or sometimes an 8. As long as the wire is strong enough still, I don't mind having a small treble right at the back. If you get those big trebles right at the back, it tends to impede the action of the lure. But if they are coming up short on it, again, watch that water wolf footage. There's loads of stuff on YouTube. Watch that water wolf footage really closely, because sometimes they'll come up and they'll track a lure where they're kind of sniffing it, or they'll come up and they'll swipe, and then it moves around, and that's a little bite that you've had, and then it might come up again. And I don't know whether it's a territorial thing. I don't know whether it's just like an instinct thing, but they're not really feeding. But it's certainly, there's a number of different ways that they can hit a lure. And T-boning is the last one, but I'll cover that in a sec when I'm talking about a different sort of hook setup that I use. So do be aware while you're out there. You know, we've all had it before. You get those days you think, I just can't get a hook up. You have to play around with your setup. You've got to play around with the length of your stinger, or consider some of these other setups that we'll go through in a second. But as a starter, that's my starter. If, for example, so just on jig head size before we move on, the classic is 1 gram per foot of water. So generally a 10 grammer will be good in around that 10 foot of water, and I can fish it sensibly anywhere from probably 4 foot down to about 15 foot or so. but it also does depend on what you're trying to achieve and how you're trying to present the lure. So if it's warm and they're shallow and I actually want to rip these through and I'm looking for really quick movements, or I really want, you know, I'm getting a lot of follows and it's very, very clear water, I really want to try and speed that lure up. Even in, say, 6 foot of water, if I'm trying to keep that lure in that sort of 4 foot zone in 6 foot of water, I have no problem going up to 15 or 20 or possibly even more, depending, you know, so which the weight of it will keep it down a little bit lower if I'm really trying to burn that lure to look for a reaction strike, or they're very, very active. The flip side of that will be those cold winter days when it's deep and slow. You want to be fishing, you know, maybe you're fishing sort of 20 foot deep and you want to be absolutely slow rolling along the bottom in that last 12 inches of water, you know, 12 inches at the bottom, just above that lake bed. And they're really lethargic, and you know, I could, even in 20 foot of water, I might go down to even a 7 gram, probably not a 5, but maybe a 7, and that will really, you know, it forces me to fish very, very slow, because as soon as I start giving it a little bit more, the lightness of that lure, it's going to start coming up in the water, you know, and so it just forces me to really slow roll then, and then you'll get those really lethargic bites. So if the lake's been iced over, for example, that's a classic case when they're going to be a little bit funky, and super, super slow is definitely the way forward. But yeah, jig heads, generally a 10 grammer is a good start for me. So when I go abroad, I'm talking UK here with a 16 centimetre. If the fish are very, very, very on it, that's pretty much the largest size that I'm going to go to in the UK, and that's a 19 centimetre shad tease. And when I go abroad, this will pretty much be one of the smallest lures that I'll put on. I just find they're much bigger, wilder waters, places in Scandinavia. I fish in Denmark a lot. You know, the angling pressure isn't quite as high. They're huge waters, they're really wild. A lot of these fish have never been caught before, and they respond really well to huge lures. You know, so if I'm fishing something, you know, in Denmark, this is probably a really good go-to for me. And it's a slightly different setup. You know, they're so aggressive as well that so you'll obviously notice the first thing is these hooks are on the bottom of the lure rather than the top of the lure. Now, you do get a slightly better hookup ratio, I think, if they're in the bottom of the lure rather than the top of the lure, because there's a few softer areas, or there's a few areas to catch in, like once you're in sort of past the scissors, in that bottom jaw, and you can find yourself getting good hookup ratios on the bottom. The problem is, obviously, you're going to be snagging with weed or debris and that type of stuff. And once you've got a decent setup like that, that is a hell of a thing to try and pull out of a snag. You know, if it's really in there, you're just going to lose your kit. So that's why that's a starter for me, because in the UK, I'm probably going to be fishing around weedy areas. It's less weedy, this type of setup, because they're on the north side rather than the bottom side of the lure. But also, I generally check the bottom more when I'm fishing in the UK than I do when I'm fishing abroad. I like to fish a straight wind quite a lot of the time, but I will be, you know, putting those longer pauses in and dropping it all the way down towards the bottom, touching bottom, and then back up again. And that setup is much more weedless for me. However, when I'm fishing abroad or for very, very aggressive fish, or in rivers, I'm not checking down on the bottom at all. I'm really trying to fish a lot more mid-water. River fish tend to be a little bit more on the aggressive side because there's a lot more flow. They're much more opportunistic feeders, and they're certainly not as well fed as, say, you know, your classic trout reservoir pike, which tend to be a bit fatter and a bit bigger and a bit lazier. But abroad as well, one of the classics that I've learned over there, really good rule of thumb, is fishing about half depth. You know, they get a lot of suspended pike, And if you're in 20 foot of water, you want to be aiming to fish about 10 foot of water. So my hooks in that instance, I get a better hookup ratio with them on the bottom, but I'm also not going to be snagging up on those weeds as much. However, there's one other sort of setup that I'd bring you on to, and this is fishing the stinger in the belly. Now, there's a certain scenario that I have found. It tends to happen when the water's a little bit warmer. It tends to happen, especially in the spring or early summer, when they tend to be, maybe they're around pre-spawn or post-spawn time. They can be quite territorial, and you can end up with a lot of hits and not a very good hookup ratio. That is the minute that I swap over to a belly stinger. And what I've found is I've actually watched a lot of pike do this in very, very clear water, and it's what I call T-boning the lure. So when a pike is in a very aggressive feeding mode, like I mentioned earlier, if you've seen those water wall things, he will come up out of nowhere, he gives that last burst, opens his mouth, and he's looking to really engulf that whole thing. That's what I call a classic feeding response. When they're T-boning the lure, they tend to come up from underneath and they will hit the lure like that. All right, and for some reason, they hit from the belly, and if you've got your stinger either out over here or they've got the lure in the way, you can see how this hook has got less chance of hitting when that pike, it's got a mouth like a crocodile, comes down. If they're on the top side, I find that the hookup ratio is very poor. But if you go over to a belly stinger, and I will actually play with rigging this, so I just prick it in like this, it looks really peculiar, but almost facing up like that is a classic on the T-boning style, because you can see as they T-bone, that's going to be much, much more, there's more chance of getting a hook hold somewhere in the mouth. So consider the belly stinger as well. In particular, so this is a Westin HD jig head, main hook jig head. That's in a 10 gram. Now, if you can see there properly, I don't know if that's in focus, you'll see that there's a small eyelet on the bottom, which makes it absolutely perfect for these types. So I can do both. I can use these HDs where I just hook them over the top of the eye there, and I'll fish the stinger down towards the tail, or it's got the loop underneath and I'll attach a stinger into the belly like that. Not many hooks on the market have that. Really nice strong wire hook, absolutely razor sharp, straight out the packet. And like I said, come in those big sizes, so you can get them in 6/0s, 8/0s and 10/0s. That's what you really want. See that gap I've got again. Few other tips just before we move on. If you're struggling with big lures, or if you're struggling with fish coming up short on a lure, or you're not getting proper hookups, that is almost instantly the moment I will go down to the 12 centimeter shad tees. All right. Big fan of pearl. Big fan. You can probably see this one as well. So, little scenario for you. Last time I was pike fishing, I was on a gravel pit and I hadn't seen any spawning activity. The fish we had caught had been in pretty good condition, but the guy that I was fishing with, my mate Tony, he had one that just started to have a few of those marks where they get a bit frisky around spawning time. They start coming up really shallow. You can often see them in the edges. That really is an indicator for me to stop fishing. Let them get on with their spawning business. However, just before that point is the time that you're going to catch the biggest pike, because they're big, they're fat, they've been feeding all winter. However, this lure is not something I would normally use in clear water. Now, we had clarity of probably about 3 foot that day, but this colour, it was a very, very aggressive reaction strike. It wasn't a feeding strike at all. We probably had a hookup ratio of about 50 or maybe 60% for the day. We had a lot of hits, and I was playing around with stingers, I was playing around with belly hooks, but it is the nature when they're not feeding because they're not engulfing the lure properly. They come up and they're looking to swipe at it. They're looking to smack it with their tail. Start getting very territorial. But this colour lure was absolutely fantastic. Now, you're probably going to notice something a bit odd here. The jig head size that I was using, that's about 5 gram. Now, we were fishing in about 8 or 9 foot of water. And what I found was I had to keep that lure in their zone, in their territory, long enough. So I was fishing it quite slow. I was sort of fluttering the lure around a little bit, and we were looking for reaction strikes. It wasn't a feeding strike at all. This colour was definitely the best. Because it wasn't a match the hatch thing. They weren't feeding on roach. They had something in their territory and that they were getting pretty pissed off by it. So this type of colour lure was absolutely fantastic. But you'll probably also notice, don't know if you can see there, but I've got a nail weight fixed into the belly. Now what that does is, when you come down on that jig head, that's probably about, I think that's a 3 gram nail weight that I've got in the belly there. And all I'm doing there is I'm keeping it as light as possible. So I've got loads of flutter and I've got loads of hang time and I'm really irritating them. But it also stabilizes the lure much, much better. Because what I found was at the beginning of the day when I didn't have a nail weight on, I missed quite a few bites. And when I caught one, when I'm fluttering that lure up, it goes into the mouth in a very peculiar way. And there was one that I hooked, the lure was kind of upside down. There was another one that I had that was literally only just a little bit of skin on the end of its bill. And as soon as I started to stabilize the lure, so a little bit more weight in the belly, then when I fluttered it up, it would sort of stay upright. So when they were coming to hit it, the hook, and I had a stinger on at the time, it's not on now, but when they were hitting it, it was more in an upright position than it was kind of flopping around because the jig head was so light, which can happen. So when you get a lot of body roll, yeah, if you fish very, very light, they have the ability to kind of fish upside down for a bit. So just consider using that nail weight in the belly to just make sure it goes upright and stabilizes the lure a lot better. That's a really good tip. Another little tip is just on sizing. So I mentioned a 16 centimeter will be my go-to. And I am a big fan in the UK of fishing the 12 centimeter. In particular at Chew Valley, I have caught, it's a very pressured water. There's some big fish there. And I really find a snack sized lure, the 12 centimeter is absolutely perfect. It's still aggressive enough that there's enough presence in the water. And I tell you what it's like when you chin a huge pike and you go, I mean, they look ridiculous. A 12 centimeter inside a 20 pounder's mouth looks like, why would it bother? But on hard pressured waters or fish that have been caught before, they can become wary. If they're not in a full feeding mood, they can become wary of those bigger lures. So one of my top tips is really scale down on that size. The 12 centimeter shad tees, yeah, I've caught more 20 pound plus fish on 4 or 4.5 inch baits than any other size at Chew. And yeah, like, it's not always the bigger the lure, the bigger the fish. So even when you're fishing for those big ones, don't be afraid of coming down in your size. Keeping it all nice and streamlined still. I'll come down a little bit in my rod size. Obviously still powerful enough, but I'll be probably fishing something more like a 15 to 50 gram casting rod rather than a classic kind of 30 to 80 gram or sort of 40 to 100 gram that I would fish these bigger style ones on. Gives you a little bit more sensitivity. Come down to sort of a 20 or a 24 pound braid on those reservoirs. There's not a huge amount of snags. You can cast them as far as possible, and you get a lot of bites on those hard reservoirs far away from the boat. So consistently making long casts is going to give you a big help as well. But yeah, so yeah, the Hypo Teez as well. This one's been absolutely shredded. In fact, I'm going to show you a few. And the Ricky the Roach I've caught, especially if the water's clear. The silhouette of this lure, if you hold it up, is just so lifelike. It's got external fins. When the water's really, really clear, this is my go-to. But I just want to give you one last tip, and I really hope that I can get this in focus. So I'm going to come in here. Now, I'm hoping it's focused. You see those slashes in the top of that bait? I've also got a similar thing here on the hypo Teez, right on the belly. I'm going to try and open that up for you. You can see those long, deep slashes. Now, that is the bottom jaw teeth. And the top jaw teeth, when you chin a pike and open its mouth, have a look at the teeth arrangement, because it can tell you an awful lot about how and where those pike are coming up and hitting that lure. So when you get deep slashes, deep prominent slashes, that is the bottom teeth. And if you get them anywhere near the head or anywhere in the front half of the body, the biggest teeth on the bottom jaw are further towards the back. So that is telling me if I'm getting big slash marks on the front, then they're being nice and aggressive, and that's exactly what I'm looking for. And generally, you'll have a really, really good hookup ratio. If, however, you're getting a few bites or a few small indications and you think they're not coming up, you'll often see what I call as almost like a sandpaper scratch mark. So a little bit like this, or you will find tiny, there's an example there, you'll find tiny, small, only a couple of mil, and you'll see 2 or 3 pricks on them. That's generally the top teeth, and they're much closer to the front of the mouth. And that's when they're coming up. And so when you're inspecting your lure, if you've had a missed bite, there is a difference to how I would change my rigging. If I was getting lots of those small indications, those small marks, it either means small fish or it's big fish that are coming up and just touching it on the front of their mouth. If I'm getting slash baits but not getting a hookup, I might actually go up a size in my stinger, or up a size trying to, they're generally kind of up for it when you're getting the slash marks in it. So there's way more, even down to the size of the teeth marks, that can tell you something about how you should tune in for the day, because that's our job as fishermen. We all want to catch the most and maximize our days, and you've got to let the fish tell you what they're up to on the day, what type of mood they're in, how they're hitting it, where they're hitting it in the water column. Keep your eyes open, and yeah, if they're T-boning it, go for a belly stinger. If you're fishing for big fish and they're really aggressive, it's a river, maybe come up a little bit, but make sure you got that proper strong tackle and those really, really decent size hooks on, because you might have to bully them away from snags, or you're looking for big fish. But on those harder waters, you still might be fishing for big fish, but think about maybe being a little bit cuter, maybe scaling down on that size of lure, and maybe being a little bit more just being a little bit more attention to detail with your presentation, because you've got to start outwitting those fish that are quite clued up if they've been caught before or there's a high amount of angling pressure. So there we go, guys. Shad Teez, Ricky the Roach, Shad Teez Slim is a classic as well, a really, really good one. But that Shad Teez is my go-to pike lure, and you won't go far wrong. So hope you've learned some things there, guys. Pop any comments in down here in the link below. And if you need me to make a video on anything, you've got any questions, make sure you drop it in the comments. Other than that, I'll see you on the next one.